Bonjour. 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 I don't think we need to stand on any formalities. It is my pleasure to make your acquaintance through my son's attachment to you and through your exploits and accomplishments you've achieved at his instigation. Before we begin, I must tell you that Eugene was the public speaker, not I. It's just that it's so marvelous to be with you this evening to experience your esprit de corps. Eugene wrote me that he knew I would never be happy unless he told me he was marvelous. Well, it looks like everything is marvelous. Now, some of you may know me as Eugene's mother, Marie Rose Eugénie de Joannis, Madame Charles Antoine de Mazenod. Now, some of you may not know me that well, but I am grateful to Jean Leflan for his favorable description of my portrait. No lack of charm, he wrote. Oh, my hands elegant and delicate. His words, they showed mystery as they toyed with a cluster of roses. This mysteriousness made it all the more alluring. Leflan also wrote that according to Eugene, I am the sweetest person in the world who drives him crazy with my complaining even when there's nothing to complain about. Huh. Madame Charles Antoine de Mazenod. I must admit, marriage in those days is not what it is now. It lacked romance. But strict rules regarding aristocratic marriages made romance a moot point. Charles Antoine at 33 and I at 18 can attest to that. Our attraction was one of mathematical calculation. I had the francs and he had the robe. Ah, my noble of the robe. Now, my family was in the pharmaceuticals, which is where my dowry came from. It made my family wealthy and prosperous. Yes. Oh, my father, he was the personal physician to the Archbishop of Aix, Aix-en-Provence. So that's a little bit about my background. I've been asked to jot down a few of my thoughts, a few of my memories regarding the celebration of 200 years of the Oblates. Very remarkable. From the French Revolution to the Industrial Revolution, Crimean War, World War, local skirmishes, a real roller coaster in 2 centuries. How could you have foreseen the hurdles that Eugene and your simple plan would lead you to? So, a few excerpts from my memoirs. I'd like to think Eugene's concern for the poor came from his experience during our exile, when due to Charles's nobility, we had to depart quickly from our beloved France. Barging down the Po River was quite a spectacle for a youngster. Later, when Charles, his brothers, and Eugene were in Palermo, Eugene spent much time with the, how would you call it, the royalist jet set. Lady Hamilton, who had such a tragic end, Lord Nelson, Queen Caroline, who is Marie Antoinette's sister, and Amelia, the future wife of Louis Philippe. Then reality faced them. Without dear Caroline's stipend, they were destitute. They was a poor. Oh, speaking of hurdles, dear Charles Antoine. We were so destitute, he tried selling the old dresses from Venice. But I'm afraid there's no stopping fashion, not even for a revolution. Now, what was attractive about the new style, the Empire style, was how it took away a lot of the frumpery and yards of fabric. You could maneuver so much more easily. Its simple straight lines disguise some of gravity's effects, while emphasizing the figure of the mature. Oh, but you're not interested in that. Now, once the dress business became impossible and Venice was no longer welcoming and Germany denied them a passport, they headed off to Naples on the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies passport. Ah, yes, about Eugene. Now, no mother wants to see her child less than the fairest and the most handsome of all. And though we could ill afford it, we had the growth removed near his left eye, which threatened to disfigure his face. And so he did develop into a sturdy fellow with a regal bearing. How would you say? An Adonis. A dashing figure. Not a figure in francs, of course. Now, already at the College of Nobles in Turin, he towered over his schoolmate, Duc de Berry. He was the heir apparent to the Bourbon throne. Eugene's leadership qualities were already evident there. They put him in charge of the dormitory. Later in Palermo, he would adopt the title for himself. Can you believe it? Count the Mazenod. But between you and me, I called him Zez. I've admitted and willingly take the blame for Zez's less than cheery disposition. I couldn't stand being cooped up with those gloomy old men in Venice during our exile, so I took sweet daughter Ninette back to France. Shortly after our return, my father died, so I was in the position to share the inheritance. So, Eugene. Now, I did warn Charles Antoine to remind his foul-mouthed son that merely because a person has a very strong and loud voice doesn't mean he cannot have a sweet character and a very sweet disposition. What's a mother's concern? Isn't it to enjoy grandchildren? Now, no matter all the flourishes of rhetoric that you sons of Eugene are my grandchildren, in real fact, not all that comforting a thought. No offense. Ninette did give me several grandchildren. Some died long before me. Too long. It would be a little strong, but not that inaccurate, to say I was opposed to Eugene becoming a priest. As a matter of fact, I thought it was a misfortune. The church was in shambles, there were no plum jobs to be had, and the nobles were not entering. I was not any happier when my grandson decided to join the Jesuits. It was disappointing to Eugene. He would have preferred him to join the oblate congregation, but Zez reconciled Ninette and himself to seeing God's will in effect. Now, where was I? Eugene's ordination. After many changes of date, mind you, was on December 21st. My mother had just died a couple of months before. That, and the fact it was up north in Amiens, so cold in the winter, partially explains my absence. Besides, it was so contrived to avoid the hands of that usurping Archbishop de Paris. It was a family friend and a royalist who did the laying on of hands. I don't think I was expected. His father only learned about it several months later. Now, speaking of Eugene and the church, where did he ever get that cockamamie idea that you could reform the church after the devastation of the Revolution? Who could reform it? Who could save the church from herself? You? You, I'd ask him, in your self-professed righteousness? You? You. I did invest substantially, though, in the project. The pipe dream? An institution can obviously exist longer than an individual, but only by recurring to its first principles, which never happens once we live at ease or in luxury. The economic theorists of our time cautioned us that vitality and ebullience are the only alternative to deadness and boringness. But as I already mentioned, I thought Eugene's experiences during our exile would have sensitized him to the problems of the poor. But it was probably that other classmate, Fauban Jansson, who could fire up Eugene with some grandiose scheme. At least Zez kept his goals succinctly delineated. He intended only to target Provence, makes him human, makes him Christian, makes him holy. Just Provence. Some of the Johanniste practicality, particularly my mother's, had its effect. Charles Antoine well recognized my mother's astute business sense, so he found her overbearing. Fauban himself, in spite of bankrupting his diocese, was a rumored successor to Bishop Fortuné. But instead, Fauban founded the Holy Childhood Society, which still flourishes and probably involves several of you. Now, having resisted all along Fauban Jansson's expansive view, Eugene's turnabout actually came from an out-of-the-blue invitation by his on-again, off-again friend, the Bishop of Digne, to take care of Notre Dame du Lau, a shrine from which to conduct missions and provide retreats. Accepting it would mean aligning two facilities and led Eugene to the drawing board to draw up the Constitution and the rules of the administration of the missionaries of Provence. No longer just aches. A side benefit of this Constitution and Rules project was that we were able to spend 2 weeks at Saint Laurent, my country home. So the retreat operation was much involved in instigating a broader vision. Now, the changes coming about through the Industrial Revolution had a sweeping bearing on life in France. New harbors, new canals, railroads, chemical plants, they all impacted the lives of the ordinary person and one's portfolio. Poverty was not a question of moral turpitude or laziness. It was the result of systemic injustices. It was increasing the distance between the haves and the have-nots. On the other hand, the Industrial Revolution presented great opportunities for explorative, expansive minds. And Eugene attracted some very audacious, a word he often used, audacious men, and incited them to go halfway around the world, some never to see France again. Missionaries were to introduce Jesus to those who had never met him. It took great ingenuity as well as audacity. By the time I died, there were several hundred oblates. The opening to Canada attracted equally dedicated men, so that there were 415 by Eugene's death. Impressive. Now, there's no reason to think he was focusing on Mary's motherly love when he chose your title. He wouldn't have experienced that from me. I guess you know me better than I thought. Now, all that financial business made me a bit hard-nosed, shall we say, unless what you'd call motherly. Expediency was more as a factor. Once his members began to work outside of Provence, he needed a more encompassing title. There were already the Oblates of Chantal, so his group would not be that indistinguishable. So in an effort to unite with Bruno Lantéri's group, Oblates of the Virgin Mary, he adopted Oblates of Mary Immaculate. That was also when one of your congregation's aims began to be education of clergy. Now, Eugene had enough practical sense to divine his projects in a simple mission statement. First, last, and always, it's God's glory, the salvation of souls, and the good of the congregation. There was no doubt in his mind that getting clarity of vision would provide a setting conducive to collaboration and broader achievement. Now, since it was a missionary group he was aiming for, you had to be trained to be self-initiators, even what they called nowadays disruptors. Now, on the other hand, corralling that energy took quite some effort. He eventually got these men to vow themselves to the congregation. Obedience, not just a division of labor a la Marx, but a labor for selfless ends. Poverty, not parsimony and destitution, but an appreciation of the worth and not the cost. And chastity, not sterility, but a source of creativity. When Eugene sought papal approbation for your congregation, he was thinking the Pope would be impressed by adding Mary Immaculate to the title, but the Pope seemed indifferent. The buzz was that it would be made a dogma. Once the Church decided, or at least when Pio IX decided, through a polling of the Church's beliefs, Eugene was really pleased. Then he was miffed when the Archbishop de Rheims, Cardinal Gousset, he voted against the dogma to avoid offending Protestants and liberals. Now, for years, Eugene did resist Fauban-Yanson's ambitious goal to venture out of France. But Marseille, being a port, was a convenient stop-off for missionary bishops on their way to Rome. Eugene developed a reputation of being an easy touch for their pleas for help. In the end, he did venture. What marvels he accomplished. What marvels you accomplished. Travel was definitely much more difficult back then, but he managed to send the members to remote parts of the world. Canada, Ceylon, South Africa, wherever. Oh, he had his dramatic flourishes, a sort of French ebullience, if that's not redundant. Such as that time, the church congregation was all in an uproar. I wrote, he scolded them for turning the church into a fish market by their clamoring. He himself storms off the pulpit in the huff, only to return at the people's imploring. Charles Antoine was there and said once Eugene preached, there was not a dry eye in the house. He could be spellbinding. Of course, his famous Madeleine sermon is familiar to you. Do you know who you are in God's eyes? Remind yourself, it was early in the morning. Most would have been in a hurry to get to work. Eugene admittedly relied on Bossuet for some help. Eugene warned you, preaching is a dangerous profession. You have to be willing to expose yourself to the scrutiny of possibly more devout people than yourselves. You have to admit your own shortcomings, even doubts. Humbleness and transparency must be the signature of oblate preaching. A congregation picks up quickly how authentic and how trustworthy you are to decide whether to accept your example and advice. Oh, I agreed with Eugene. Tempier paid too much for that carriage he bought from his arch enemy, Joseph Thomas, the former prefect of the Bouches de Rhône. For years, Thomas had been against the Mazenods. As the Acacia affair resolved itself, politique as ever, Thomas assessed Eugene to be a man of good sense, with a sense of humor and spotless morals, not made for an ill-defined episcopate. Not too bad from someone who had been downright hostile to the Mazenods for years. So the carriage was a double delight for its stateliness and its reminder of Thomas's loss of the election, despite Eugene's always getting riding sickness when he was in it. He was no longer a tête. It takes much savoir-faire to make one's way through French politics, not to mention the churches. Eugene's elevation to the episcopacy was definitely a show of ecclesiastical intrigue, if I might say. Ultimately, it resulted in Zez's being named Bishop of Marseille, which he claimed was a trick played on him by Uncle Fortuné, who caught Eugene napping. His emphasis on the poor did open his heart to the ordinary people. That would remain one of the hallmarks of his legacy. As he saw it, the wealth, if any, that you accumulated was patrimony of the poor. You must be frugal to be lavish in your assisting the poor. On a different subject, both Ninette and I were horrified at how Zez staffed his household. One had his whims, wouldn't come down to serve. Another, as loyal as the day is long, but a disaster as a servant. One who was just not much good. Madeline, who had little common sense, spent all her time flirting. But none of these equaled Francois Vez. The French do say no one is a hero to his valet. So Francois took advantage of a church blessing to throw the key in the holy water bucket, shouting epitaphs you wouldn't use on the docks, much less in church. Lots of eyebrows raised there. Eventually, after all the litigations, Eugene forgave him, but Francois died in prison. Oh yes, those silver candlesticks in Les Miserables, according to some, were suggestive of Eugene. But actually, it was a bishop of the neighboring diocese of Nîmes. The story did provide an example of what Victor Hugo saw as exemplifying society's need from the church, swayed less by privilege and more by practice, concerned less with position and more with meeting real needs. His attitude was enough to get him seen as a critic of the church, not a promoter. Needless to say, it got his books placed on the prohibitive list, which is a surefire way to get them read. Now, another thing about Eugene. Can you imagine where my son got the gall to embarrass the Empress by refusing the dinner set before him because it was Lent? I mean, your present is all that's needed, not your appetite. Eugene, of course, had a hard time as it was tolerating any of the usurpers, Bonaparte's relatives, even though his cousin Louis Napoleon had Eugene named senator and agreed to building his cathedral in Marseille. It was never a calm relationship. Was that ever happen between the church and the throne? Really, Zez, I would tell him, you cannot seriously believe the original sin is laicism, that the laity want to govern the church. Even his welcoming the Society of St. Vincent de Paul to the diocese was not all that popular with the pastors because no priest could be an active member and the director would be a layman. The laity would say, We just want those governing it to be serious about it. Now, where could your missions have gone without lay folk and just ordinary people? Let's change the subject. Now, Eugene's mollifying claim of no pretensions to that kind of clerical grandiosity was widely known. But he did think his seniority and long service at least made him prime material for a cardinalate. After the French withdrew its protective troops from Rome, though, there was no way Rome would recognize France. So, Eugene had to settle on being senior bishop, which he still claimed was a trick played on him by Uncle Fortuné, who caught Eugene napping, as you recall. So, a senior bishop, not an archbishop even, of France. Louis Napoleon, as much as he could, tried to soothe Eugene's chagrin by nominating him senator of the Republic. The Pope did bestow a pallium to him and his successors, but he would not make Marseille an archdiocese. Let's be straight with each other. It was Eugene they canonized, not me. It was farthest from my mind that I was helping to farm a saint. Some of his antics didn't strike me at all as saintly. Surely not practical. When he was canonized, there was some hype that Eugene could well be the patron saint of dysfunctional families. There's no denying what we were. What's one of your popular expressions? Who puts the dis in dysfunctional? Well, women get more than their fair share of blame for family breakdowns. So, equally, there needs to be as much attention to women's education. You, however, should be applauded that your schools in Muslim areas and Buddhist areas also admitted women. Hardly a popular undertaking then or now. Whoever says one is graced with long life hasn't lived to 92. That's how old I was when I died. Eugene was by my side, even had mass at the bedside, but he could not stay for the funeral. He officially had to get back to Marseille to vote. Fortunately, that dear, sweet Alexander took care of the funeral. You could always count on Alexander. My mother had taken him into our family as a baby where he grew up. Alexander Dupuy. For a while he joined the Oblates and actually helped by preaching at Notre Dame du Lac and making urgent repairs on the 150-year-old building. And you know what kind of work that involves. Eugene once claimed it was never to be part of his legacy to found a society of insubordinate, religious backbiters and grumblers. His members were, through community, to focus on loyalty, being non-judgmental, respectful of each other, even while challenging one another to excel. A bit idealistic, but a proud boast once you achieve it. Seems to be ideal qualities tested by 200 years of practice. All the more urgent to guarantee a future. Do we dare use that 20th century word? Sustainable? Now, Eugene was crushed by Father Favre's put down when Eugene approached him with an offer to merge Favre's community with Eugene's recently papally approved Oblates of Mary Immaculate. The French, Father Favre claimed, are too unstable, too hasty, and too superficial to accomplish anything solid and durable. Nonetheless, Eugene was such a Francophile that he warns the congregation never to lose its French preponderance. What would Father Favre be thinking now? You must be thinking, when will she ever stop? And I really must. How should I say? Whoops. Felicitations. Congratulations on achieving your 3rd century. As staggering as the last 2 centuries were, it's almost insurmountable to imagine how the next century will be with all the hurdles. Be audacious. First, last, and always. The greater glory of God, the salvation of souls, and the good of the congregation. Merci and bonsoir.